negotiated understanding or pact between an existing authority and one or more contending political elites who have the power to impose some or all of their demands. Examples in point are the German pact constitutions during the 19th century, the Portuguese constitution of 1996, the Spanish constitution of 1978, and the South African interim constitution of 1994. All five variants, the referendum, the Constituent Assembly, the parliamentary, the imposed, and the pact constitutions, will most often appear in a constitution-making process in some or other conjunction. Constitutions elaborated by a specially convened Constituent Assembly may in fact turn out to be merely an endorsement of a constitutional understanding or pact formulated outside that assembly to overcome a logjam, as happened in the case of the Portuguese Constitution of 1976, where two formal agreements and pacts were negotiated and celebrated. In another variant, constitutions enacted by an existing parliament may have been preceded by extensive debate and review in first and second tier assemblies, as was the tradition in former Soviet bloc or Soviet-aligned socialist countries. What about now African constitutionalism and what some call the virtual African constitutions? The 90s of the last century were the decade of the advancement of multi-party democracy in Africa. Of a total of 53 independent African states, before and up to 1990, only 9 had a democratically elected government. The early independence period, from the 60s through to the early 19s, had been characterized by imposed constitutions. Most independence constitutions were modeled on precedents found in Eastern Europe, in very many cases in former East Germany. For example, in Angola, on 11 November 1975, a constitutional act was passed by a resolution of the Central Committee of the then MPLA Independence Party, and this fact was simply recorded in Article 60 of this new constitution. Article 1 of the Constitutional Act proclaimed the new independent state of Angola as a country where, I quote, any form of exploitation of man by man, end quote, would be abolished. And Article 2 announced that the MPLA party was thus installed as the only lawful political party in Angola in order to exercise complete control of the state and all its organs at all levels through a system of appointed commissars, as further and stipulated in Articles 31 to 52 of a further party resolution gazetted as Act Number 1 of 1976. Post-colonial states in Africa simply continued the authoritarian legal traditions imposed by colonial powers on the basis of newly founded legitimacies, even where they did not opt to copy the Soviet model. The most important tool of colonial administrations had been the curtailment of basic economic freedoms, subjecting all and any activity, including the most menial informal sectors, services or trade, to rigid licensing and permit requirements. Coupled with the denial of the freedoms of movement for persons, services and capital, the colonial legal tradition was one of excessive control. On independence, these legal traditions were simply continued, as the new governments were characterized by political insecurity and had but frail authority. One of the famous authors, Mabwezi, showed in his first and original book on African constitutionalism that the independence constitutions had been drawn up outside Africa, inspired by legal traditions and values and ideals that were never rooted in that continent. The few African drafters and scholars involved in this process had been thoroughly assimilated to Western European or alternatively Soviet socialist values, and in turn their ideas and writings remained stale and alien in their African environment. The misconception in the first post-colonial wave of constitution making was to encourage a selective reception of constitutional law, placing the doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty at the center of all considerations to the detriment of the proper understanding of the rule of law, of the modern evolution of the constitutional state, and the supremacy of the law of the Constitution. No wonder that with the demise of the Soviet power in 1989 came the end of an international superpower rivalry that had sustained African governments as client or satellite states of one or the other. And as from 1990, the stage was set for a wave of constitutional reform and transformation across the African From 1990 till 2000, 36 countries held multi-party elections for the first time, or after re-emerging from some kind of dictatorial or military rule. A further 5 countries held non-party, and another 8 held normal second or third term elections. To date, all 47 sub-Saharan countries, which is all of Africa except for Algeria, Egypt, Libya, Morocco, Tunisia, and Western Sahara, have held regular and repeated elections. Over 260 elections by now, thus seeking to base their governments on a process of democratic legitimacy. However, and as most recently confirmed in 2009 by a study of Bogart, it is true that parliaments in Africa continue to be dominated by one hegemonic political party, mostly reliant on historic legitimacy. The advent of multi-party democracy required constitutional reforms in all countries. As of 2004, all 54 nations have either written a new constitution or modified their previous ones. The central question obviously is whether the second wave of constitution making in Africa since 1990 has fared any better in overcoming what is termed dual authority, following Whitaker's fundamental study on the politics of tradition. Dual authority, or legal dualism, or the existence of two publics in Africa, refers to the realization that social reality and political culture in African societies differs from the Western European and North American concepts of the constitutional state. Lusophone Africa refers to acknowledged and hidden second public with the illustrative term of Africa Profunda. Critics point out that the second wave of constitutions produced mostly constitutional propaganda. And Klug, in a contribution in 2001, suggested, even in respect of the South African Constitution of 1996, that this constitution was at risk of becoming an irrelevant constitution because it had failed to impose moderation and control over the exercise of political power and failed to respect minimal standards of socio-economic rights. If we believe that it is a fundamental condition for the good functioning of a multi-party parliamentary democracy, that the opposition can realistically assume the role of the institutionalized hope of the minority to become tomorrow's majority, then this essential condition is absent in most systems of government in Africa. As a rule, opposition parties are ill-tolerated, and wherever their support rises above 20 to 25%, they are perceived and often openly accused as constituting a threat to national peace. As a result, opposition parties in Africa continue to be weak, fragmented, limited by predominantly ethnic allegiances, underfunded, personalized and divisive leadership, and tend to be short-lived. Every government in Africa since 1990 has acted, nevertheless, in reference to its constitution, to the constitution-making process, or to the constitutional values, invoking what it believed to be the best or most adequate interpretation of a particular principle or procedure. Especially Zimbabwe confirms this assertion. The intense and most damaging political conflict in that country is centered on its constitution, on the process to apply it, on the accusations that certain policies were adopted in violation of that constitution, and on the possible timing, process, and direction of changing the constitution or drafting an entirely new one. I want to now have a look at two African experiences, the South African and the Angolan one, and maybe in passing or later we will also remember the West German experience. The South African experience teaches us that the importance of the constitution-making process is absolutely essential. South Africa's 4-year-long conflict resolution process, starting in February 1990 with the legalization that recognized, with the legislation that recognized and legalized the liberation movements as political parties, and ended in April 1994 with the first free and general South African elections. This process needed to overcome a hopelessly fundamental antagonism. The liberation movements insisted that they had fought and won a just war that had been consistently sanctioned and legitimized by the United Nations and every other organ of the international community, and this was very much a foundation of their political identity. It was inconceivable to them that they should have to accept that the brutal actions taken by the apartheid government and its agents to obstruct this struggle should be regarded as equivalent and equally legitimated countermeasures adopted in self-defense, as maintained by the outgoing apartheid government. The true relation of forces, as sustained by a variety of international interests and the determination of the key players to succeed, diffused this fundamental contradiction by molding the entire transition process into the context of constitution making. This means that peace was sought and brought about within and by means of the constitution-making process. At the end of 4 years of constitutional negotiations, and in terms of the interim constitution of 1994, and a specially enshrined basic pact known as the Constitutional Principles, peace was established. The foundation of this entente was the consensus that the country should be modern and liberal, albeit developmental, but always a constitutional state in the sense of the German Rechtsstaat, the protection of which was entrusted to a fully independent and professional constitutional court. And this consensus has held firm for the past 15 years and has immensely contributed to the advance of constitutionalism in all of Africa. Today, 11 countries in Africa have fully fledged independent constitutional courts, and a further 8 have an independent constitutional council, whilst 22 states have entrusted some form or other of constitutional review procedures to their highest ordinary court. South Africa hosted in January 2009 the first World Conference on Constitutional Justice in Cape Town, with 93 constitutional courts from all over the world represented. At the center of this successful constitution-making process was the technique applied throughout the entire procedure to achieve partial and piecemeal agreements or small or little pacts, which became one by one the building blocks and pillars of further and more comprehensive agreements. As the first constitution of '94 was still a transitional instrument that had been negotiated without a specific electoral mandate, the first parliament elected in '94 with specific constituent or constitution-making powers produced the '96 final constitution. Now let us turn to a slightly different model that seems to be challenging the South African experience, and this is the most recent exercise of Angola. The new constitution, which came into force on the 5th of February 2010, just over a month ago,